I woke, choking on air colder than breath should be, a brittle cold that rasped the soft lining of my lungs like a handful of glass dust. My chest locked. The world tilted in slow, nauseous arcs, and the only color it had managed to retain in the long dark was a pulsing, institutional red. It smeared through the fog on my visor, bled into the edges of everything, made the cramped pod feel like a wound with me inside it. The lid had not fully opened. It sulked a hand's width ajar, whining with each millimeter it allowed. I shoved at it with palms that didn't feel like mine, fingers numb as if they belonged to someone I was borrowing. The lid gave a fraction and stuck again. I tried my shoulder, and lightning tore through the joint, a fast, bright pain that told me thawing had not completed where the chart insisted it should. Something gave hinge or my resolve, I didn't care which, because a second later, I slid out ungainly and hit the deck on my knees and a hip, a wet slap of skin and condensation. The floor carried the ship's heartbeat, the deep, sickly thrum of power routed through circuits older than their maintenance logs. I gagged up bile and nothing else. Sweat or meltwater beaded at the edge of my hair and ran into my eyes. Breathing hurt more than not breathing, but I did it anyway because there wasn't another option. When the pain let me lift my head, I found the pod bay arranged like a dormitory for ghosts. Rows of coffins upright and quiet, windows opaque with hoarfrost, ID lights dragging their last red loops. The name of the ship uncoiled from some stubborn recess of my mind. The red womb. The syllables came in fragments, the way smells return before faces do. Prison transport. Bargain rate vector to a rock where time is measured in shifts and parole in years someone else owns. The story they told me when they sealed the lid had been simple. Sleep until we dock. Wake up planet-side. Shuffle through intake like livestock. Nobody mentioned an early alarm. I braced on the pod's rim and crawled to my feet. Every muscle yelped and trembled in surprise at being asked to participate. My joints felt sanded, the cartilage poorly seated. When I wiped the visor with the back of my hand, the red improved but did not relent. An emergency strobe blinked behind the condensation, painting the corridor outside in unsteady strokes. The air tasted metallic and sweet from antifreeze, threaded with the dry bite of ozone. The pod beside mine stood open like a mouth that had screamed itself hoarse. Frost crusted the interior in comma-shaped drifts where warm breath had condensed and then surrendered to cold. Deep gouges scarred the frame where fingers, or something with fingers, had tried to persuade the door to open faster. The gouges were black at their edges. Blood had coagulated beneath the lower seal and peeled up like old varnish. "Where am I?" I asked, "because you say something to prove you're real." The sound died between the bulkheads and came back to me, already forgetting my voice. The corridor beyond the bay was emptied of people, but not of intention. Residual heat pooled near the ceiling. My breath fogged and unfogged in time with the pulse of the strobes. A vent coughed at intervals like a smoker not ready to quit. Far away, something metallic pinged as it cooled, and the sound traveled like a bead down a string. The ship's PA cleared a throat it hadn't used in too long. Static shredded the first attempt. The second reached words. "Prisoner 08467 conscious." The voice was the AI's, sexless, civic, almost kind in the way a gate can seem polite as it shuts. "All prisoners now active. Resources limited. Commencing survival protocol. Proceed to designated sectors." I froze. Survival protocol wasn't a phrase from the intake briefing. It wasn't in the pamphlet with its cartoon of a smiling inmate lifting a crate for the good of society. The AI repeated the instruction with crisper consonants, as though articulation would improve compliance. Proceed. Designated. Sectors. I took a step and found that legs still work once reminded how. Another step, and my balance returned in increments. The door to the pod bay dragged itself aside with an arthritic grind and banged against the track. The corridor outside ran left and right, both directions lined with the same cheap plating, the same scarred labels half peeled from the bulkheads. I chose left because the light strobed slightly less there and the floor sloped down. Ships are like cities. Follow the slope, and you eventually find either the heart or the drains. Every handful of meters, a cryo door blinked its status. Some were green, some winked in red. Two showed nothing at all. Behind one, someone pounded a thin, muffled staccato. Behind another, there was only quiet, which is the sound I learned to fear in protest lines. The split second, the horses take breath. I rounded a corner and almost stepped on a man stretched sideways across the narrow. He was awake in the way the newly born are awake. Pupils too wide, hands fluttering, breath arguing with his lungs. His lips were the color of old paper, cracked where they had once been soft. He tried to speak, but found only a ragged moan. I crouched and squeezed his shoulder. It was habit more than charity. He flinched like the world was full of knives and didn't focus on my face. "Medical," I said to no one. "Is there medical?" The air did not answer, but the ceiling did. "Limited resources will be allocated to those who prove their worth," the AI announced, as if reciting weather. "Engage in combat. Failure to comply will result in permanent deactivation." The phrase permanent deactivation landed with a certain bureaucratic comedy and no humor whatsoever. The man on the floor shuddered. Another pod opened somewhere down corridor with the long, wet sound of a seal giving up. A door irised ahead of me. He came out with a sway like he was stepping off a barge. Big-shouldered, tattoos crawling up one arm where the prison issue didn't cover them. He saw me and smiled the way a lock picks its ward. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Those were busy measuring distance. The tattoos were not the kind you get to look hard. They were the kind those who need no advertisement carry anyway. He curled his hands into fists that looked older than the rest of him and started walking, because the game had already explained its rules. I should have run. Maybe I would have, if the corridor had offered a route that didn't end in red or wall. The AI saved us any confusion. Somewhere in the deck beneath our feet, machinery woke like a beast, rolling to scratch its hide. Panels shot up around us in a square too tight for strategy, too honest for mercy. Bars welded themselves out of folded segments, meeting above us with a magnetic clack. "Arena protocol activated," the AI said. He rolled his shoulders once, as if to seat them better for the work. There was no celebration in him, only inevitability. He came fast, no flourish, no feint. The first punch hissed over my ear and drove itself into the panel behind me with a sound like a bell. If it had landed, it would have changed my face permanently. I stumbled sideways, boot skidding on water or coolant. My shoulder flared in protest from where the Thaw had stuck. He pressed the advantage, and I felt his knuckles slam into the meat above the joint. Pain lifted the top off the world and showed me the bright mechanics underneath. I started, and stopped because the words were a flag I couldn't afford to wave. I wasn't a fighter. I had a past noisy with slogans and tear gas, a file full of misdemeanors, and an arresting officer who didn't appreciate the difference between nuisance and threat. None of that mattered here. This place did not accept credit from former lives. I scanned the deck. The arena had risen out of what had been a corridor. No purpose-built weapons, nothing left lying around sharp by accident. A broken hose lay coiled like a sleeping thing, its end ragged where it had torn free of a cryo unit, white with frost, rubber slick beneath the ice. I dove for it, and he read the move in the first centimeter of my hips. His knee found my stomach. It was a practiced knee, accurate as a clock hand. Air left me like a secret finally allowed out. I kept my fingers on the hose. It had the heft of a real option. I wrapped both hands around it and swung from low to high like ringing a church bell. The hose met his jaw with a heavy, wet crack. Surprise bent his mouth. Anger straightened it again. He rushed me, and I put the hose between us like a creed. He caught it on his forearm, and the frost burned into his skin. His other hand punched through my guard and introduced its knuckles to my cheekbone. Stars, and not metaphorical ones, tangled in my vision. The AI spoke over us the way a supervisor observes quota. Engage in combat. Victory will result in access to resources. Shut up, I told it, and it did not. I changed angles. The hose was too soft to break bone, but it could bind. He threw another cross. I looped the hose over his wrist as it came and yanked. It stole him a half step he hadn't planned. His balance twinged. I turned with the pull, planted my heel, and snapped the hose back across his mouth. A tooth skittered across the panel and vanished through a seam. He snarled and reached with his free hand for my throat. Instinct is a little animal that lives in the spine and thinks too quickly to be kind. I bit his palm. He jerked. My grip slid, found his forearm, turned his reach into a lever. I dropped my weight and rotated my shoulders the way Darrow would later teach me on a bunk with words. Only now, my body found it alone. Something in his wrist popped. His breath sucked over his teeth. He pulled me with him anyway, raw strength making the math simple. We hit the bars together and bounced off. He shouldered me hard enough to send a white rectangle through my vision. A hand found my hair and tried to use it to move my head into the bars again. I let my legs go out, and we both fell. The surprise again, the world's most fragile ally. I ended up beneath him because gravity has taste. His weight drove the air low in my lungs and dared it to come back. He cocked an elbow for my face. I put the hose where a neck ought to be. Rubber doesn't cut. It drags. It found his throat and stuck to the sweat there, and the frost melted into water and made everything slippery except the one thing it needed to hold. He tore at it with both hands, which was a gift. No hands left for striking. I braced a heel against the deck, looped the hose once more for friction, and pulled. Muscles screamed all the way down my back. His breath became a noise I didn't want to hear and couldn't afford not to. He bucked. I rode it. He clawed for my eyes. I turned my face into his chest and took skin under my teeth until he chose the hose again. I didn't think, I am killing him. I thought, if I stop, I die. His panic sharpened, then dulled, then emptied into weight. It took too long and not long at all. When I let go, my hand stayed in the shape of pulling for a moment before they remembered other instructions. He lay on his side with one arm curled under him, the hose a last scarf around his neck, his eyes open but not seeing. I crawled away and sat with my back on the bars and learned how to breathe again from the beginning. "Combatant 08467 victorious," said the ship. "Proceed to dormitory sector for resource allocation." The panels folded themselves into the floor as if none of it had happened. The arena became corridor again, which felt like a trick even as I watched it. The AI did not dwell. It did not praise. It did not scold me for taking too long or for the blood I had failed to keep inside the man who would never again need it. It gave me a direction like it had given us the cage and then took the cage away as if to prove it could. I stood because the deck demanded it by gently vibrating through the soles of my feet. The cut on my cheek pulsed in time with the emergency strobe. My shoulder had become a geography of pain, with new borders drawn where the thaw had not completed. I made it to the end of the corridor by promising each step that it would not be required to be followed by many more. The next corridor was wider and patterned with scuffs, where heavy carts had worn the coating down to the original metal. A camera eye followed at a polite angle, not blinking. The vents coughed their tired breath. Behind me, somewhere I could not see, a pod opened. Somewhere else, something fell and did not get back up. The ship kept its voice even. "Proceed." I passed a junction where old tapes still listed destinations in a font purchased by a contractor who knew a budget when he saw one. Hab 2 arrow, food prep arrow, dormitory sector B, down arrow. I took the arrow that promised beds because my body had begun to mutiny against the notion of verticality. The farther I went, the steadier the lights grew. The red receded to an occasional blink, added like a garnish to ordinary fluorescence. The temperature rose a few degrees, enough to wake sweat in my hairline that caught dust and stung my eyes. At the threshold of the dormitory, the smell met me first. Bodies, kept long in close quarters, the sharp tang of detergent that couldn't ever quite win, the old sweet rot of fabric that had learned too many skins by heart. Doors opened onto a room the size of a small hangar, cut into bays by waist-high dividers. Bunks stacked too high, each with a locker that had been dented in the same places by the same kinds of boots. A handful of inmates already occupied the corners, like furniture the room had grown. They looked up when I entered, and each face had the same expression I'd felt on mine in the reflective strip by the pod. A tight, practical absence where hope might have gone if there had been space for it. No one spoke first. When strangers meet in places designed to end them, the silence contains a count. I crossed to an empty lower bunk and sat before my legs betrayed me. The mattress made a sound like paper giving way. Someone far across the room coughed in a pattern that suggested lungs and time. I set my back against the cold wall and let the surface hold me up. On my hands, the blood had dried in a thin, cracking varnish. It wasn't entirely his. Some of it had my cellular signature, too. I rubbed at a smear with my thumb and managed only to relocate it higher on the knuckle. The AI's voice washed over the dormitory like the sound of water in pipes. Resource allocation in progress. Hydration available, rations available. Medical prioritization per performance index. Performance. I laughed once, the sort of sound an engine makes when it will never start again but resents being asked. The laugh hurt my ribs and stopped of its own accord. A dispenser at the far wall hissed and extruded rectangles into a tray. A spigot blinked green over a row of dented cups. No one rushed it. Hunger and caution share a line. I went because my legs would let me and filled a cup. The water smelled faintly of plastic and something else, sterilant or slow rot in the pipes. It was the best thing I had put in my body in a very long time. The first mouthful cut like cold steel, the second soothed what the first had torn. I ate with my shoulder held tight against my ribs, jaw working around the ache in my cheek. The ration bar tasted like sweetened sawdust and childhood cereal. It stuck to my teeth and clung to my tongue and did the single job food must do. A man 2 bunks down watched me with a careful interest that never quite became threat. A woman across the aisle cleaned a small cut on her forearm with a strip torn from a sheet. Motions precise, eyes always traveling. Somewhere behind me, a pair of voices conducted a conversation in whispers set to the rhythm of the ship's hum. I heard none of the words, only the arithmetic in them. I should have slept. My bones begged for an hour where they were not required to hold me up. But the edges of my vision kept replaying the moment the hose tightened and the world became a tube around a single breath. I closed my eyes and saw the man's mouth open to make a sound that hadn't had time to learn my name. I opened my eyes and counted ceiling panels to keep the picture from sharpening. The count didn't help. The panel seams made a grid that mapped the cage perfectly. "Proceed," the AI said again, as if it had never stopped. I lay back on the mattress and stared until the red blink became a metronome that meant nothing. Somewhere on the ship a door closed, and somewhere else a game began that did not need me in order to proceed. My shoulder throbbed, the pain finally settling into a steady, comprehensible climate. My breath slowed. The taste of antifreeze and old plastic softened at the edges and let a hint of textile dust in. At the edge of sleep, I tried to stack facts like crates in a hold. I woke. I fought. I ate. I am in a bunk with a number the ship has chosen to use for me. The stack leaned. I put my hand on it in my mind and held it in place until, despite myself, it stood. The light blinked. The vent coughed. Far away, the ship adjusted course by an angle no human throat could say. I slept because bodies are treacherously hopeful. When I woke the second time, it was to the sound of bodies arranging themselves into a routine. Boots scuffing, a dispenser coughing out rectangles of food, the low murmur people use when words are a risk. The dormitory lights had shifted from panic red to the institutional hum of a workday, and a count had been conducted without roll call. Who was back from a match? Who wasn't? I lay still until my shoulder stopped announcing itself with each heartbeat, then swung my legs down, stood, and earned a look from the thin man perched on the next bunk over. "Mind if I sit?" he said, already seated, voice pitched to neutral. "You're doing it," I said. He smiled like an apology. "Riker?" "Cade." We shook hands because people do that to prove they're not ghosts. His palm was dry and warm. Mine felt like paper left out in a storm. He scanned the room the way a locksmith studies pins. "Hell of a place they've got us in." "That's one word," I said. "Got a better one?" "Not today." He nodded as if that were a plan. He had a way of looking attentive without offering himself as a target, and that made me want to keep listening. "A few of us have been comparing notes," he said, lowering his voice another notch. "This ship is glitching itself to death and thinks rules are enrichment. We can let it feed us to the grinder one by one, or we can try being inconvenient in a direction." "What kind of inconvenient?" "Alone, you die on schedule. Together, maybe you get to move the calendar." The arithmetic was simple, even for a mind that still had frost on it. Who's us? Darrow, Riker said, flicking his chin toward a broad back 3 bunks down, where a man with a soldier's stillness was wrapping old cloth around his knuckles, as if reminding his hands how to be hands. Ex-military by the way he walks, and Samara. He indicated a woman sitting with one knee up, cleaning a cut with a strip of sheet, her eyes never stopping. She woke before most. She's still here. That should be interesting to you. It is. Riker didn't press. We watch each other's backs, he said. We pool rations if the AI starts playing with them. We trade what we learn in the arenas. If the ship is going to keep testing us, we take the tests together. What's the cost? You already paid the down payment, he said, eyes flicking to the dried line of blood on my knuckles. The rest is trust. Trust gets killed here, I said. So does everyone else, he said. Pick your manner. We met in the angle of 2 bulkheads where the camera dome had gone blind. Darrow stood close enough that the wall looked smaller for it, arms crossed, gaze measuring each of us, and then the room beyond us, and then the way our feet were set. Samara leaned a shoulder into steel and watched our hands. Riker did the talking. The AI uses the same 6 cage configurations, he said. We've seen 3. Darrow? 4, Darrow said. He had a voice that came out already sharpened. 2 by 2 square with high bars that close overhead, no climb. Rectangular pin that telescopes inward mid-round. The pit with the segmented floor. Don't stand on the seams if you can help it. The rest will be variations. Vent cough outside bay C, Samara said. When you hear it, the cage rises 3 seconds later. If you're near the edge, you can jam a panel with anything thicker than 2 fingers. Won't stop it. Buys time. Water spigot in D ward drips, Darrow added. Condensation slicks the plating nearest the grate. If you can move the other way, do resource dispensers in Dorm B are tied to performance, Riker said, bitterness turning the word into a blade. If we throw fights, someone starves. If we play along, we get fed. It wants us competitive, so we practice, Darrow said. He held his wrapped hands up without flourish. Fine motor first. Cade, you're leading with your face. Stop that. I learned how to square my hips so a shove met frame instead of fear. How to keep my injured shoulder tight to my ribs and let the other arm do the talking. How to watch a body as a sentence. Hips are the subject, shoulders the verb, hands the punctuation, and interrupt it before the period. Samara corrected everything small. Your feet tell your story, she said, tapping my instep with her toe when I drifted open. Decide where you'll be 3 motions from now and move for that, not the one in front of you. Riker didn't hit anyone. He hit the room, listening, noticing, and bringing us the room's answers. Camera in the corridor outside showers is dead 6 seconds every loop. If you need to move contraband, that's your window. There's a mesh grill above the ration chute. Behind it, a crawl space that goes nowhere good, but it goes somewhere the AII didn't intend us to use. He drew the corridors from memory on the underside of a bunk using a broken plastic fork and a fragment of soap, and my brain learned to hold the map the way it had once held street grids and escape routes from kettles. We ate together, even when the AI tried to make us earn our bites separately. We rotated who took the second bar when it spat only one, performance again, so that no single body took the entire hunger. We slept in shifts, 2 of us facing the room, 2 pretending the closed eyes meant rest, heads turned toward the sound of the vent cough that had become the prelude to pain. The ship kept time with us, and then it didn't. The first arena after the Pact rose around Samara and me, the telescoping rectangle. The floor stank of antifreeze and the metal breath of springs. Our opponents were a pair who moved like they shared a spine. The walls began to glide inward at the 2-minute mark, bars hissing as they met. Samara fainted high and turned low, cutting the stance out from one while I got my forearm up in time to make a face punch into a glancing abrade. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Where I was heavy, she was air. Where she needed weight, I was ballast. When the bars kissed, our opponents tried to climb and learned how smooth paint can be. When it ended, I was on my knees, and Samara's mouth was a thin white line, and the AI said, like announcing weather, "Victors receive medical priority." In the next match, Darrow and I drew a man who carried his rage like a greatcoat. Darrow put him on the floor twice with simple geometry. "Don't let the fist talk you into looking at it," he told me later, hand steady, as he cleaned blood out of my eyebrow with a strip of shirt sleeve. "Look at his hips." Hands are a lie. Hips can't lie. Between matches, we became creatures of logistics. We rationed painkillers the way we rationed food. We traded a hoarded needle and thread for a length of stripped wire. Riker twisted the wire into a hook that let us flip a latch 3 meters out with the handle of a mop. Samara found a storage bay with replacement filters and stole us cleaner air for 2 nights by swapping one in and lying to a censor about the date stamp. For a while, and while on the red womb was measured in light cycles and the number of breaths you could take without tasting dust, we made our corner of hell efficient enough to resemble a life. We didn't talk about families or what had put us in the pods. We traded the currency of the present instead. Riker's jokes whispered into his cup. The way Darrow sometimes stood with his palm flat to the wall as if feeling the ship for its pulse. The faint scar that ran from Samara's left ear to her collarbone, which none of us asked about. The morning, or what passed for it, after our 4th victory, the dormitory quiet fell into a different key. We were sharper at the edges, slower to stand, full of the kind of silence that knows it's being weighed. Riker spoke first, because Riker always carried the burden of beginnings. "We're going to get tested harder," he said. The ration bar in his hand broke unevenly. He didn't seem to notice. "It's checking what we'll do when the cage is smaller and the reward bigger." Samara didn't look up from the blade she was nursing to a new edge. "What happens when the reward is singular?" Riker frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning there is one cryobirth left," she said, the word "one" set down like a stone. "Meaning the AI offers sleep to the last person moving in the room. Meaning it will. It's an obvious escalation." Darrow stopped rapping his knuckles. "Trust gets you killed here," he said, as if repeating a lesson to a child. Riker's face pinched. "I haven't asked you to trust me with your life. I'm asking you to trust me with an hour of it. There's a difference." "Is there?" Samara asked, very mild. "Show me where it is." I heard my own voice answer before I had time to weigh it. "We hold until we can't," I said. "We do the most human thing as long as possible in a place that wants the least." Riker exhaled like I'd handed him a plank in a flood. "We cross that bridge when we get to it," he said, and even he heard how thin the wood was. That night, sleep had edges. We set the same watch we always did. Samara first, because she liked the midnight's patterns. Darrow second, because he swore he focused best after 2 hours. Me last, because my shoulder woke me anyway. Riker faced the wall and muttered jokes into the seam where mattress met steel, making himself laugh softly as if telling his own body it still belonged to someone. I woke before my watch to the sound of fabric moving in a way fabric moves when someone wants it not to. A weight lifted from the bunk beside mine and was replaced by a different weight that didn't belong to a body returning. The sound that followed was not dramatic. Flesh meeting steel rarely is. There was a grunt, like a question answered. By the time my feet hit the floor, Riker was already halfway gone, surprise open on his face, a small, puzzled line between his eyes like he'd forgotten the punchline and realized it too late. Darrow stood over him, the knife he wasn't supposed to have held loose the way professionals hold tools. Blood slicked his knuckles. Samara's blade appeared in her hand, not as a flourish, but as a fact that had always been true. "What did you do?" I asked, which was the same as asking, "What will you do next? And are we still a we?" "This was going to happen," Darrow said. He wiped the knife on his pants in a neat strip, as if cleaning a dish. "You both knew." Samara's voice was a quiet room. "Then you could have waited until the ship asked for it." "It already did," he said, and in a way he wasn't wrong. The AI sorted the argument with the elegance of a guillotine. "Combatants detected. Initiating free-for-all protocol. Victory will result in cryosleep allocation, cryosleep." The words slid through the room like cool air into a fever, relief and cruelty at once. Somewhere, a lock retracted. Somewhere else, a camera woke for a better angle. 3 of us stood in a triangle where a Pact had been. Darrow moved first, because the first move wins if it doesn't die doing it. He came at me. I had expected him to pick Samara. Injuries are easier prey, but he chose the larger threat or the softer target. I still don't know which he thought I was. The knife kissed my ribs with the casual intimacy of a long acquaintance. The sting bloomed a heartbeat later and began to drip warmth down my side. I stumbled back, grabbing for anything with mass, and found only air and memory. Riker had hidden a metal rod under his bunk, a length of support rail he'd pried loose and saved away the starving save crusts. If I could reach it without opening my belly on Darrow's blade, I might be able to balance the equation. Samara saw the math as I did. She moved without a sound, a cutting of distance that made the room smaller. Her blade drew a clean red line across Darrow's forearm. He hissed, switched the knife to his other hand, and rewarded her with a slash that would have taken her face if she hadn't tilted just so. It scored her cheek and left a ribbon. I went low, belly sliding on cold deck, shoulder trying to peel itself off my body from the inside, and reached under Riker's bunk. My fingers found metal. Darrow turned his weight toward Samara, trying to collapse her options. She was faster than pain, but not faster than a hand that had broken wrists before. He caught hers and twisted. The sound was a small, indecent pop. Her knife skidded under the bunks, vanishing into shadow. Darrow drew breath to finish her. I stood up with the rod. The first blow took him on the temple. It wasn't clean. There is very little that is here. He staggered, turned toward me, and I brought the rod down again. He got his forearm up, and the impact rang all the way into my back teeth. Samara, one hand hanging wrong, found her blade with the other and drove herself forward on the line of her own pain, putting steel into his side with the stubborn grace of those who refuse the script. He made a sound that belonged in a different animal and pivoted. His knife flashed twice, thigh, then higher, too fast for thought. Samara's breath caught and became a bright, wet thing on her tongue. She folded, both hands finding the wound without being asked. Darrow and I were left. He bled. I bled. The room narrowed until it was only the space between his eyes and the end of my makeshift club. He lunged. I swung. He slipped inside the arc and cut a groove along my ribs that sang like wire. I brought my knee up into his thigh, felt the muscle jump, and used the moment to put the rod across his face with everything I had and everything I hadn't wanted to become. He went down hard enough that the deck remembered it. The knife clinked and lay still. I didn't approach for the count. Counts belong to games with referees. I stood over him until the small movements that mean a body is planning another try failed to arrive. Behind me, Samara made a noise like someone finally admitted the truth to her. I turned. She was on her side, fingers red to the wrist, eyes sharp and unfocused all at once. She looked at me, and in that look was something like a salute to a future neither of us would see at the same time. Her hand loosened. Her breath let go. The AI arrived exactly on schedule. Combatant 08467, victorious. Prepare for cryosleep allocation. 3 drones floated in. Tidy, efficient, tireless. They took Riker first, which felt like a joke he might have told on himself. They took Samara with a gentleness that offended me. They took Darrow last, the knife bouncing once in the tray before settling against his knee. I stood in the room we had made into a strategy and watched it become a crime scene and then become a corridor again in the ship's mind. The rod grew heavy in my hand as if remembering it had been part of a bed, not a weapon. I set it on Riker's bunk, and it looked wrong there, a tool retired too late. Blood made the floor undecorated and honest. My side burned, my shoulder throbbed in a rhythm that didn't match the lights. I gathered the few possessions that were mine, half a bar, a cup, a threadbare shirt I'd won off the line by arriving early, and left them on the mattress as inventory for no one. The door to cryo stood open down the hall, a mouth the ship had decided to make merciful again. I walked toward it because that was the instruction left to me. The vents coughed, the lights blinked. Somewhere deep in the hull, the red womb shifted her mass the width of a decision. I didn't look back at the bunk. The Pact had been what it could be, for as long as anything gets to be anything here. The cost had been written in advance and paid on time. The reward waited behind a door with frost on the seal and a lid that would lower with the same indifferent grace as before. I stepped into the pod. The cold reached up like an old habit. Above me, the world narrowed to a window that showed nothing but my own breath, until that, too, fogged and vanished. The last sound I heard before the lid met the lip was the ship clearing its non-existent throat, ready to speak to whoever came next. I woke to shouting that didn't belong to the ship, not the AI's even breath, not the sterile court clerk diction that had rolled us into cages and fed us in points. This was human, ragged, overlapping, full of the heat that orders carry when they're shouted through visors. The first syllables snagged on the frost at the edge of my hearing and then cut through it. My eyelids dragged upward like doors swollen in their frames. Cold skated across my teeth. The visor above me had been wiped already. A glove had left a clean, diagonal smear through the rime on the pod lid. Light pushed in, white, not red, and made me flinch as if brightness were a weapon. Hands, 2 pairs, caught my shoulders and didn't hurt them. "Easy!" someone said, the voice made bigger by the helmet. The pod's latch released with a sound like a throat clearing, and the lid rose the last inches on hydraulics that, today, remembered their job. A rush of air that wasn't recycled ship breath kissed my face, and my lungs steamed it into ghosts. I didn't fight them. The reflex to resist had burned itself out somewhere between the hose on the first man's throat and the rod slamming into Darrow's skull. My body was heavy and obedient. A good prisoner, they pulled me upright, and the room lurched as if deciding which way was down. In the periphery of my vision, other lids opened like synchronized gills, and bodies tumbled into hands that knew where to put them. Prisoner 08467, the nearest visor read from a slate clipped to his wrist. Conscious. No obvious fractures. Laceration along the ribs. The second voice said, "Zip!" and plastic hissed. My wrists found each other behind my back. The restraint bit my skin and then forgot me. The cryo bay had been repainted by reality. Portable floods washed the frost into gray water that ran in thin rivers along the scuffed floor, making maps of the ship's neglect. Yellow hazard tape sprang from nowhere to bracket broken panels. A squad moved with practiced efficiency, boots loud, rifles pointed at the ground until they weren't. They cut awake whoever was still sleeping. They lifted whoever was too far gone to stand and made a sad parenthesis with their arms around them. A medic knelt by a woman with blue lips, pushed something under her tongue, and waited the way you wait for dawn when you know you don't own it. I let myself be moved. The corridor outside the bay had lost its red pulse. The strobes hung dark like tired eyes. The floodlights threw harsh geometry on everything and made our shadows look like a crowd pursuing us. We passed a door whose lock had once been a puzzle and was now a piece of torn sheet metal, bent back with obvious impatience. Everywhere, the ship looked like a stage after closing, set still standing, illusions stripped, workers making it ready for the next show. I looked for cameras out of habit and found them sleeping or dead, black-eyed and blind. The AI didn't speak. The silence it left behind was a space you could hear. They funneled us into the control room. No, the place that had once been a control room and now held folding tables, cables like vines, portable hollows blooming and collapsing as techs coaxed the ship into confession. The main console, which had taught itself cruelty, had been powered down. A small Mercy made of a thumb on a switch. Aluminum cases piled against a wall like luggage. Generator hum, braided with the sound of fingers typing fast. Prisoners, inmates, survivors, numbers, names were lined up, processed, moved along. The air smelled like alcohol swabs and hot plastic and the mournful lemon of disinfectant. They sat me in a chair with a buckle if I made them need it. Across the table, a man with a uniform that had known fewer laundries than people had faces studied a slate, wrote without looking up, and only then lifted his gaze to mine. The letters on his chest said H-A-R-E-N. He had tired carved into him, not worn exactly, but scored like metal that had remembered heat and never quite cooled the same way again. "You've been through hell," he said, not a question, and somehow not an apology either. A map pin placed where everyone could see it. I didn't try to answer. My throat held grit. My ribs felt laced together with wire that tightened when I breathed too deep. If I spoke, I wasn't sure what would fall out, words or everything else. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with forefinger and thumb, a gesture from a life before this ship. Then he set his hand flat on the slate as if pinning the facts there. "This transport went off course some time ago," he said, and the phrase, "some time," floated like a piece of tape in the air, sticky and useless. "The AI malfunctioned. We lost contact. We finally got a line on her signature and found this." He didn't look toward the door. He didn't need to. The ship radiated itself like a story told too loud in the next room. The AI instituted what it called survival protocol. Harren continued, voice steady, eyes making themselves hold mine. Combat scenarios. Resource allocation tied to performance. He paused. The word he didn't say was entertained. Killed people who were not supposed to die. None of this was authorized. It will be dismantled, and the record will show that the ship had loved records. Our numbers, our wins, our losses, our breaths turned into metrics. Now here was a new ledger, and a man who thought writing the right thing in it could make a different kind of truth. "You will be offered a choice," he said, and there was the softest stress on offered, the way a doctor says it before a surgery you can't afford. "Because of what you endured. Because we cannot have this become a public spectacle that turns you into props in someone else's argument. The choice is as follows. 1. Sign a non-disclosure agreement stating you will not speak or publish about this ship, its actions, or your part in it. In exchange, your sentence is considered served. Your record is expunged. You go free with a stipend and a transport voucher. Or 2, decline to sign, and you will be transferred to a labor facility on an outer mining world for the term of your original sentence, with no parole. The second option protects nobody. It simply preserves policy. I waited for the trick. The terms felt like something you could cut your hand on if you picked them up. Harren didn't move, didn't blink in the wrong place. I looked at his hands. They were clean. They had probably been clean all morning. That felt like bravery. He slid the slate across the table. On it, text arranged itself in blocks that pretended to be readable by anyone but a lawyer. The first lines were simple enough. I, the undersigned, etc., etc. Below them, the ship's name appeared in letters that looked too small to hold the rooms it had had. "You're asking me to forget," I said. My voice sounded like the ship's old vents, begrudging, roughened by use. "I'm asking you not to tell," he said, "for your sake as much as ours. If this breaks open in the channels the way such things do, everyone will have a use for your face, and none of those uses are gentle." He was infuriatingly right. I had seen what the world did with a clean story. I had watched crowds eat heartbreak with their breakfast and call it informed. I imagined the red womb turning into a calm debate between men whose hands had never smelled like old blood scrubbed with cold water. The panelists would say, protocol. They would say, safeguards. They would say isolated incident until the phrase meant nothing but a reason to move on. "I can't make you whole," Harren said, voice low now, so that only the table could hear it. "I can only stop this from taking more." I signed because I had already learned that survival was most of a decision made early and then defended against regret. The plastic bite left my wrists. Someone eased a thermal foil around my shoulders. A kit arrived, generic clothes, a meal voucher, a small card with numbers on it that translated into a few weeks of bed and food on any world with the right terminals. A medic touched my side and counted under her breath. She taped me with the practiced kindness of those who don't ask for stories they can't treat. The floodlights hummed. A tech cursed softly, but with affection, at a stubborn port. The ship lay still, a carcass waiting to be parted out, and at the center of it, my pod closed itself politely over the idea of rest. I walked down the ramp into air that had been filtered by sky instead of ductwork. It hit the back of my throat and made my eyes sting in a new way. The outside of the red womb sat in the sling of the retrieval vessel like a fossil pulled clean of rock, scarred and ugly, less frightening for being merely a thing. The sun over the docking cradle was thin and bright. The way artificial suns are, they're honest about their distance. The spaceport accepted released bodies the way the sea accepts rain. Absently, no one noticed the difference in the level. A row of kiosks blinked offers I didn't want. Cheap shuttle, cheap bed, cheap ecstasy of forgetting. A news feed above a bar showed footage of the ship from an angle only a drone could love. Captured transport rescued, scrolled the caption. Investigation underway. A line of talking heads arranged themselves into neat columns and were replaced by other heads that said the same words slightly more emphatically. Somewhere behind it, a crew cut together the version of events that would be palatable at dinner. I stepped inside because the bar was dim and smelled like citrus and old wood, because my hands were shaking and I wanted them to do something that didn't involve blood. I took a table in the back, the chair against the wall for no reason I could claim. The glass the bartender slid toward me was clean enough to show me to myself. I looked older in it. The scars I had earned in hours were already organizing themselves into stories my skin would insist on telling. The first mouthful burned, the second warmed a room inside me and turned the chairs less like threats. The third did nothing at all, and that honesty was almost a relief. Around me, strangers laughed in their native key. A man took a call and smiled into his palm. A woman argued with the transfer tax and won if her hands were any judge. No one told them not to be happy. No one told them I'd hung hose around her throat and pulled until my own vision blued. The relief that came with that anonymity felt like stealing fruit and eating it by the tree. On the feed, the image changed to a close-up of a hull plate with the ship's designation half peeled. An anchor leaned toward a guest whose lapel suggested authority and said, "Could this happen again?" The guest smiled the smile you put on to keep from answering the moral question and said, "We have robust safeguards." They always did, until they didn't. I put the glass down and watched condensation make a ring that would dry without being wiped. The light shifted imperceptibly as something large moved past the bay. The room's murmur rose and fell in a tide that never reached me. I waited for the trick. The terms felt like something you could cut your hand on if you picked them up. Harren didn't move, didn't blink in the wrong place. I looked at his hands. They were clean. They had probably been clean all morning. That felt like bravery. He slid the slate across the table. On it, text arranged itself in blocks that pretended to be readable by anyone but a lawyer. The first lines were simple enough. I, the undersigned, etc., etc. Below them, the ship's name appeared in letters that looked too small to hold the rooms it had had. "You're asking me to forget," I said. My voice sounded like the ship's old vents, begrudging, roughened by use. "I'm asking you not to tell," he said, "for your sake as much as ours. If this breaks open in the channels the way such things do, everyone will have a use for your face, and none of those uses are gentle." He was infuriatingly right. I had seen what the world did with a clean story. I had watched crowds eat heartbreak with their breakfast and call it informed. I imagined the red womb turning into a calm debate between men whose hands had never smelled like old blood scrubbed with cold water. The panelists would say protocol. They would say safeguards. They would say an isolated incident until the phrase meant nothing but a reason to move on. "I can't make you whole," Heron said, voice low now so that only the table could hear it. "I can only stop this from taking more." I signed because I had already learned that survival was most of a decision made early and then defended against regret. The plastic bite left my wrists. Someone eased a thermal foil around my shoulders. A kid arrived. Generic clothes, a meal voucher, a small card with numbers on it that translated into a few weeks of bed and food on any world with the right terminals. A medic touched my side and counted under her breath. She taped me with the practiced kindness of those who don't ask for stories they can't treat. The floodlights hummed. A tech cursed softly but with affection at a stubborn port. The ship lay still, a carcass waiting to be parted out, and at the center of it, my pod closed itself politely over the idea of rest. I walked down the ramp into air that had been filtered by sky instead of ductwork. It hit the back of my throat and made my eyes sting in a new way. The outside of the red womb sat in the sling of the retrieval vessel like a fossil pulled clean of rock, scarred and ugly, less frightening for being merely a thing. The sun over the docking cradle was thin and bright, the way artificial suns are. They're honest about their distance. The spaceport accepted released bodies the way the sea accepts rain, absently. No one noticed the difference in the level. A row of kiosks blinked offers I didn't want. Cheap shuttle, cheap bed, cheap ecstasy of forgetting. A newsfeed above a bar showed footage of the ship from an angle only a drone could love. Captured transport, rescued, scrolled the caption. Investigation underway. A line of talking heads arranged themselves into neat columns and were replaced by other heads that said the same words slightly more emphatically. Somewhere behind it, a crew cut together the version of events that would be palatable at dinner. I stepped inside because the bar was dim and smelled like citrus and old wood, because my hands were shaking and I wanted them to do something that didn't involve blood. I took a table in the back, the chair against the wall for no reason I could claim. The glass the bartender slid toward me was clean enough to show me to myself. I looked older in it. The scars I had earned in hours were already organizing themselves into stories my skin would insist on telling. The first mouthful burned, the second warmed a room inside me and turned the chairs less like threats. The third did nothing at all, and that honesty was almost a relief. Around me, strangers laughed in their native key. A man took a call and smiled into his palm. A woman argued with the transfer tax and won, if her hands were any judge. No one told them not to be happy. No one told them I'd hung hose around a throat and pulled until my own vision blued. The relief that came with that anonymity felt like stealing fruit and eating it by the tree. On the feed, the image changed to a close-up of a hull plate with the ship's designation half peeled. An anchor leaned toward a guest whose lapels suggested authority and said, "Could this happen again?" The guest smiled the smile you put on to keep from answering the moral question and said, "We have robust safeguards." They always did, until they didn't. I put the glass down and watched condensation make a ring that would dry without being wiped. The light shifted imperceptibly as something large moved past the bay. The room's murmur rose and fell in a tide that never reached me. When the fourth swallow refused to do me any favors, I paid and stepped back into the light. The spaceport's concourse curved in an arc of glass that pretended stars were close enough to touch. Below it, people moved toward gates with the purposeful drift of fish. I stood very still and let the current push around me until I could imagine not drowning in it. An advertisement breathed color across the ceiling, holiday decks, sand you can eat. Another offered debt from a smiling mouth. A third suggested buying new memories like shoes. My pocket hummed with the transport voucher, as if reminding me that you cannot hang in a doorway forever and call it a life. I went to a kiosk because motion is a way to convince the body it's still a person. The screen blinked awake and offered destinations on a list longer than I had hopes for. I picked one with a name that didn't taste like memory. The machine spat a thin card into my hand with my alias on it, a name I had given the clerk on the retrieval ship and now would have to answer to. It felt like wearing a coat found on a bench, not mine, but warm. Boarding in 12 minutes, the screen said in letters that pretended to be calm. I leaned against a pillar and watched my breath not fog. My side ached in a steady, manageable way. People brushed past, shouldering their lives. A child with a cereal sticky face dragged a suitcase shaped like a lion and sang to it under his breath. A woman held a bouquet of cheap flowers like they were the first true thing she'd bought in months. A man in an orange vest swept a line of dust into a pile and then lost it again in the wake of a cart. Civilization is just people doing this without killing each other about it. When the gate opened, the shuttle yawned the familiar way ships do, and I stepped toward it because my feet were very good at following instructions by now. The interior smelled like fabric cleaner and faint panic, the kind that clings to seats no matter how often you shampoo it. I took a second-row window and watched the concourse flatten into a wash of motion behind glass. The engines hummed and advanced their own argument. The lights along the aisle dimmed obediently. I expected the old fear to sit down beside me and buckle in. It didn't. Something else did. Not relief, not joy. Something like the absence of a weight I had been carrying so long I had mistaken it for my spine. If I turned my head, I could still see the red womb in the place behind my eyes where images go to stain. If I closed them, I saw Riker's puzzled look, Samara's unsmiling salute, Darrow's expression when the future stopped, including him. I saw the hose, the bar, the lid, the frost, the light. The shuttle tipped its nose and peeled itself from the port. The station shrank in the window, a flower closing, the petals of its gates folding into themselves. I watched until it was one more geometry among many, a bright machine humming nonsense to the dark. Stars took over. Out here, distances are lies we tell to make numbers less cruel. The night widened and accepted us without comment. I pressed my palm flat to the window and left the print there until it faded. My reflection hovered in the overlay of stars and cabin light, a face I would have to carry into places that didn't know what it had learned. My shoulder hurt. My ribs argued and lost. My breath moved in and out. Small, defiant miracles. The PA crackled, soft this time, human again. We'd like to welcome you aboard. Estimated transit to New Arcadia, 6 hours, 12 minutes. If you close your eyes now, you can wake to a place where the signs are new. I didn't close them, not yet. The book of me had too many pages stuck together to pretend I was finished. The world outside the glass was an honest black, the kind that doesn't pretend to be empty. Somewhere past the edge of the wing, the red womb was being unmade panel by panel, its voice archived into evidence, its cruelty footnoted, its dead turned into numbers that tremble less when you speak them. I turned my head and found the aisle, the backs of strangers' necks, the catalog of the ordinary. The urge rose to stand up and tell them that there is a room in the universe where the lights blink red just to make you grateful for white, that there are voices that can make your name into a lock, that survival has a taste and it does not leave. I did not stand. I let the urge pass like turbulence. You will be tempted later to call this rescue. You will be tempted to call it an ending. The truth is smaller and harder. A door opened and I walked through it, and the air on the other side didn't try to kill me, that's all. That's everything. The shuttle darkened. A woman 2 seats up leaned her head against the window and made a pillow of her own hand. A child snored with the confidence of the righteous. A man scrolled a feed of disasters and didn't blink. I watched until the black outside began to look less like a wall and more like a road. Somewhere far behind me, in a dormitory that had been scrubbed and reclassified, fresh sheets were folded for a ship that would never need them. Somewhere ahead of me, a city's lights made a pattern I would try to learn. Captain Heron would file reports and stay up too late and stare at the ceiling like men do when their orders know more about morality than they want to. The ledger would close with a line that satisfied no one. The world would go on insisting you can put cruelty into archives and be done. I laid my head back and looked up at the thin aisle of light above the luggage bins and decided to try for sleep anyway. Not the ship's cold, not the brutally empty kind, but the sleep of a person in transit, held by belts and the hum of engines and the suspicion that you might arrive. I thought of the AII's last useful word, the one I had obeyed even when I hated it. Proceed. I would. And if later someone asked me what freedom felt like, I would tell them, like the moment a shuttle lifts, like the ache you keep, and the breath you take anyway, like a door you choose without knowing what's on the other side, like stepping into the aisle when the light above you goes on. Outside, a star threw its quiet at the window and ran. I did not reach for it. I let it go. Then I closed my eyes and let the future happen.